Climbers will often tell you that when it comes to outdoor rock climbing, Adam Ondra is the best to ever do it, by a long shot. They'll say things like, he might not be the strongest or have the most endurance, but there's no one on earth who can read routes and execute perfectly, quite like he does. And well, they're absolutely right. Here's a chart of the world's best boulder flashers. For every V13 they flashed, they get 1 point. For every V14 they flashed, they get 5 points. And for every V15 they flashed, they get 18 points. You'll probably recognize some of these legendary names, such as Noah Wheeler, Tomoe Narasaki, Aiden Roberts, and Daniel Woods. Going up a bit further, you'll see some infamously good boulder flashers, such as Jimmy Webb and Will Bosey. But going further, in an entire league of his own, is Adam Ondra, more than doubling Will Bosey, who is in second place. But wait a minute, I made this graph back in February, and since my last video, the GOAT has continued his bouldering tear, flashing 2 more V15s in the lion's share and Celestite, the latter being a Dave Graham FA that was put up as V16 and features some of the most cryptic and technical climbing in any hard boulder I've ever seen, surely being impossible to flash by anyone else other than the one and only O-Dog. When adding these two in, Adam more than triples Will Bosey's score, coming in at a whopping 102 points. Alright, so quick edit. Apparently he just flashed another V15. I don't know if the info is going to be publicly released by the time I upload this video, so I'm not going to say which one, but it is supposedly the hardest one yet. Damn near bordering on V16. So who knows? By the time you watch this, maybe he's already flashed 5 more V15s and a V16. To put this into perspective, climbers such as Hamish MacArthur, Alex Magos, and Simone Lorenzi, obviously incredible climbers in their own right, all come in with less than 8 points on this graph. Oh, and did I mention that Adam is not even a boulderer? If you needed any more evidence that Adam Ondra is by far the best to ever strap on a pair of climbing shoes, well, now you have it. A perhaps more interesting question though is, who is the best boulderer in the world by redpoint ascents? Well, if we use the same scoring system as before, but now where V16 is 1 point, V17 is 5 points, and V18 is 18 points, interestingly, Adam Ondra falls only to 9 points, behind people like Noah Wheeler, Hamish MacArthur, and Daniel Woods. Going a bit further, we have Zach Galla, Sean Rabatou, Sean Bailey, Jakob Schubert, and Aiden Roberts. Then, a step above the rest, we have Simone Lorenzi and Will Bosey, who both have been on an absolute tear in recent years. But it is Elias Aignema, fresh off his ascent of Exodia, that actually takes the crown, with a score of 31, having 1 V18, 2 V17s, and 3 V16s under his belt. Since Exodia is unconfirmed, if we give him 15 points instead of 18 for this ascent, both Will Bosey and Simone Lorenzi edge him out, having each 5 V17 boulders under their belt. Now, bouldering is cool and all, but many will argue that the pinnacle of the sport still lies in sport climbing. So, who's the best sport climber of all time? You probably know the answer, but it's probably a lot closer than you'd think. Using the same scoring system as before, with 1 point for 9B, 5 for 9B+, and 18 for 9C, we start the list with climbers such as Yannick Flohe, Will Bosey, Jonathan Siegrist, and, interestingly, Chris Sharma. Despite being a contender for the greatest of all time, Chris Sharma only racks up 13 points on this chart, showing just how insane the level has become in recent times. Going further, we have Sean Bailey, fresh off of his ascent of Duality of Man, arguably the hardest climb in the world, on around the same level as Alex Magos and Jorge Diaz Rullo. Going up even further, we have Stefano Ghisolfi and Jakob Schubert, both of whom have been on an absolute tear in recent years. The former FAing Excalibur 9B+, and the latter FAing Project Big, a long-standing Adam Ondra project. But then, in a league of their own, we have two names that stand above the rest. The first is Sebastian Buon, and the second, of course, is Adam Ondra. I think we all expected Ondra to be first here, but the difference between Seb and him is actually much smaller than I expected. In fact, with some of Seb's recent progress on his insane projects, maybe he'll be the first to dethrone Adam as the best sport climber we've ever seen. But regardless if he does or not, Seb probably doesn't get the credit he deserves with how close he is to beating the GOAT in his own kingdom of sport climbing. Now, we've already seen hard boulder flashes, but what about the even more impressive feat of a hard sport climbing on-site, where you have no prior knowledge of the route, no beta, and have to sight read everything on the fly? Well, it turns out there have only been 7 people to have on-sighted routes graded 8C+ or harder, showing just how much more difficult and perhaps just how much more goes into a hard on-site compared to a hard boulder flash. For each 8C+ on-site, the climbers will get 1 point, and for each 9A on-site, they will get 6 points. At the very bottom of the chart, with 1 point, we have people such as Ramon Puyblanque, Damen Skafich, and a little-known Norwegian climber named Magnum Midtoe. People often see Magnus nowadays as just a fitness YouTuber that climbs occasionally, but people forget that back in his prime, Magnus was undoubtedly one of the best climbers in the world, having done this feat that only 7 people have managed to do all the way back in 2013. In this lower part of the graph, we also have Pachi Usobiaga, again with 1 point, as well as Laura Rigora with 2 points, the only woman on this list, and who is also one of the best outdoor female sport climbers in the world. Then, taking a huge leap up to 15 points, is Alex Magos, the first person to ever on-site 9A, all the way back in 2012. And of course, to the surprise of absolutely no one, Adam Ondra sits yet again in a league of his own, with a whopping score of 50 points, again more than triple of second place. It's interesting to see that Adam, while not the strongest and perhaps not even the person with the highest projecting ceiling, is just so much better than everyone else at moving well, reading routes, and executing on rock. Like, these are some of the greatest climbers of all time, and he continues to just brutally frame mog everyone like it's nothing. Now that we've broken down a lot of the world's best outdoor climbers, I think it's time we take a look at the world's best plastic pullers as well. This is a graph of every competition climber to ever win the World Cup Series or World Championship gold medal, gaining a point for each boulder, lead, and combined victory. Many old school legends are seen at the bottom, such as Dmitry Sherafutdinov, Jerome Mayer, Francois Petit, Thomas Randzik, Sean McColl, and Alexandre Chabot. Interestingly, a lot of modern day comp climbers are not here, which just goes to show how competitive the highest level of the sport has become. Even Serato, who's probably the best male comp climber we've ever seen, only has 5 points. But to be fair, he's only 19. Going even higher, we have another old legend in Kilian Fischhuber, and the GOAT dynoist Tomoe Narasaki, one of the only entries on the list who is still active, as well as yet another old legend, Francois Legrand, who to this day still holds the most number of combined lead World Cup Series and World Championships, despite doing this in the 1990s. Then, yet again, even though he is not known for being a comp climber, we have Adam Ondra in second, with a total of 11 wins, and Jakob Schubert at the very top with 13, despite never having won a bouldering title, but only ever lead and combined. Jakob is another climber who I don't think gets enough credit, being one of 3 people to do both 9C and V17 boulder, and on top of that, being the greatest male comp climber ever, and he's still going strong to this day. For the women's, we have a few familiar faces, such as Jessica Piltz, Natalia Grossman, Anna Storr, and Jane Kim, as well as some older climbers such as Muriel Serkany, Mina Markovic, and Robin Erbsfield. One of the best more modern comp climbers is Akio Noguchi, who is married to Tomoe Narasaki, almost certainly being the strongest comp climbing couple the world has ever seen. We also have Angela Eiter, who is also one of the best female sport climbers ever, being the first woman to ever do 9B. In second place, we have Sandrine Levet, who absolutely dominated bouldering in the mid-2000s. And to the surprise of absolutely no one, Yanya sits completely untouched at the very top, almost doubling the woman in second place with 20 wins. This is made even more insane when you consider many of the modern competitors to Yanya barely even show up on this graph, as this is by far the most competitive period we've ever seen in competition climbing. Speaking of strong women in climbing, with Brooke Rabitu's recent ascent of Excalibur, the gap between men and women in sport climbing is now only a single grade. I've seen some discussions that this is perhaps the closest women have ever been to overtaking men in grades, but after doing some digging, this actually turns out to not be true. This graph shows the hardest sport grade climbed by a woman versus the highest sport grade climbed by a man at the end of each year. Historically, the gap averages to around 2 grades. However, the largest gap occurred in 1987 after the first consensus 8C was climbed by Wolfgang Gillich, called Wall Street, where the gap reached 4 grades. The smallest gap actually occurred in 2005 when Hosune Bereziartu climbed a route still graded 9A/9A+, called Bimbaluna, when the hardest route grade was 9A+, only a half grade gap. It is interesting to see how much closer the gap between men and women are in climbing than most other sports. In fact, did you know that in bouldering, there was once no gap at all between the hardest problem sent by a woman versus a man? This is a graph of the hardest bouldering grades climbed by a woman versus a man over time. As you can see, the first data point for a woman does not come until 1989, showing just how new of a sport this is, especially for women. The very early days of female bouldering featured quite large gaps due to the lack of female boulderers, but this gap shrunk quite rapidly, and in 2003, the gap actually completely disappeared for a whole 5 years after Hosune Bereziartu again did something incredible, an 8C boulder traverse, completely erasing the gap between men and women. This ascent is honestly a bit confusing since climbing history lists this as a font 8C+ route, but then has boulder in the description, so I don't know what to make of this. If someone has more info, let me know in the comments. Also, if you're enjoying this video, I'm trying to get to 4,000 subs by the end of the month and would really appreciate it if you'd subscribed. Hosune was incredibly ahead of her time, being the first woman to climb 8C, 8C+, 9A, and 9A+ in sport, as well as both V14 and V15 in boulder. She's honestly a contender for being the most underrated rock climber in history, as the boundaries she was able to push for women in the sport is honestly astounding. Since then though, the gap between men and women has widened a bit, and currently sits at 2 if Exodia holds up as V18. Interestingly, the gap in hard onsights and flashes of sport routes also was once erased between men and women. Since flashing and onsights have become blurred over time, if we treat flashes and onsights together in sport climbing, one of the first recorded instances of a hard sport climbing onsight was the legend Lynn Hill's onsight of an 8A called Simon, which happened to be the same grade as the hardest male onsight at the time as well. However, the gap began to widen, but almost was closed again in 2006 when, yet again, Hosune did an onsight of an 8B+ called Hydrophobia. The gap currently sits at either 1 or 2, with Yanya flashing Puro Dreaming without the use of knee pads, potentially placing this as the world's first 9A flash from a female. This route was originally given 9A, but downgraded by using knee pads, but Yanya forewent the use of knee pads during her ascent. She also had very little beta prior to the ascent, although it is probably not fair to call this a true onsight, but insanely impressive nonetheless. Perhaps if this wasn't her limit, she can be the first to match Andra's insane feat of flashing a 9A+, something that has not been repeated since Andra did it in 2017. The final thing I wanted to take a look at is the gap between the hardest flash ever done versus the hardest redpoint ever done. Have people gotten better at flashing over time? Or is the gap pretty consistent between how hard people can climb versus how hard they can flash? Well, here's a graph that shows just that. Again, for the purposes of this video, we are lumping in flash and onsights together, as the difference between them has become more and more blurred with the internet, spray, and heavily chalked holds. Interestingly, the gap between the hardest redpoint and flash does not seem to be getting closer. In the 1990s, there was a period where there was a huge gap of 6 grades, but since then, it seems that the number of grades between flash and projecting is around 3 grades. I do think people have definitely gotten better at flashing and onsighting, but people have probably also gotten better at projecting, as well as sinking an enormous number of sessions into climbs, causing the gap to not get closer than around 3. The only instance of it falling to 2 is in 2007, when Pachi Usobiaga did an onsight of Bidzi Uskeraz, the world's first 8C+ onsight. In bouldering, the gap has actually widened slightly over time, being around 2 grades in the 2000s, and now consistently being at 3 grades, if Exodia holds as V18. It does seem to be the case though, that even the best flashers in the world climb 2 to 3 grades harder projecting than they do flashing, and this seems to be pretty consistent with my experience as well. So if you find yourself climbing way harder than you can flash, or flash almost as hard as you can climb, it could provide some insight into what to work on. And there you go. I plan on doing even deeper dives into some of these topics in the future, and I'm a huge nerd, so I love working with numbers and visuals. So if you don't want to miss on any of that, be sure to subscribe. Also, let me know which graph you thought was the most eye-opening in the comments. And I hope to see you back here very soon.